Hello everyone, and welcome to this climactic and final Deltarune theory from me for this section of the Deltarune theory eras, I guess. This will be the last Deltarune theory I will make before Chapter 5 releases. Maybe my last ever, but, you know, never say never. This theory is my magnum opus, in a way. This is my grand prediction about the overall themes and the ending of Deltarune. And it is based on a theory I made during Chapter 2's theory cycle with Deltarune, before Chapter 3 and 4 released. This theory also was called Shadows on the Wall, and I'm going to give you a brief recap, but I should let you know before we begin that this theory goes deep. All right, so deep that I have spent this entire section of making theories since Chapter 3 and 4 released, setting up the groundwork for this theory. This was the first theory video I wanted to make. After all, Shadows on the Wall is probably my theory that has stood the test of time the best after Chapter 3 and 4 came out. However, everything I'm about to tell you is crazy. Like, it is founded in the themes and some evidence in Deltarune, and yet it feels insane to say it, okay? And so I wanted to break down the more silly, I guess, elements of this theory in their own videos so that when I got to this one, I could point to those videos and say, if you think I am crazy, maybe watch one of these old videos that talks about what I'm talking about in more depth and you won't think so, or maybe you'll think I'm even crazier, but at least you'll know where I'm coming from. So if you haven't watched these old videos, you can still watch this one. You'll just have to take me at my word a bit more, because I'm not going into quite as much depth as I did in these original ones, obviously. I would say the one that I would suggest the most, well, there's two really, but the top one is A Tale of Water and Glass. That one deals with a lot of the themes of Deltarune, and so does this one. So that's a good primer if you just want to watch one of them. Although, I mean, other than maybe The Night is Fear Part 2 and Origin of Darkness 2, where I'm only taking a little bit of those videos, the rest of them are pretty tied into this. And yes, even Kris Knight. Also, I guess I should say, these 6 videos all have the prophecy style thumbnail, same as this one. I made some other theories that don't have that. They aren't going to tie in here, except for one little thing from one, but I'll explain that when we get to it. So now you know why it took me so long to make this video, all right? So, let's start with a recap of the theory from Chapter 2. This is one that anyone who's only been watching me recently might not know about. So, Shadows on the Wall. What is it? So, it's a Deltarune theory I created based on an allegory by Plato called the Allegory of the Cave. And here's basically the rundown of that, okay, in very simplified terms. Imagine you've lived in a cave your whole life. You're one of these prisoners in the image on the left. You're chained facing the wall of a cave. To you, when you hear sounds and see these shadows being cast upon the wall of the cave, you think as those shadows as what is making those sounds, because this is all you have ever experienced. You've never actually gone outside the cave, you've never actually experienced the truth, and so your lived experience becomes your reality. And obviously, this is an allegory from Plato. You can take it a lot of different ways, but for the sake of this theory and how I think it applies to Deltarune, the idea is essentially that these shadows are not real, right? But they are representations of what is real. And therefore, you could think of those shadows as darkners, right? Darkners 2 are not technically real, but they are based on real things, and they are sort of the connotations of those things, which you could essentially call an object's shadow in a metaphorical sense. These are details about an object that are not, like, visual or tactile, but we assign to them anyway. Like, for example, the one I always bring up and the one I brought up back then, rules card, right? Rules card is based off the rules card in a deck of cards, and rules is very wordy and kind of useless and overly foppish because the rules card uses a lot of flowery language, and so you associate those traits with it even though it doesn't have its own personality because it's an object, right? And so that was the basic idea of Shadows on the Wall. I took it deeper, however, after chapter 3 and 4, I don't think those assertions still hold water. Water, get it? Because Deltarune and water. Anyway, I basically said that Gaster was trying to snuff out that fire in the picture so that the cave dwellers would be cast into darkness. And therefore, instead of the shadows becoming their reality, like the roaring explains, the shadows, the darkeners are sort of destroyed during the roaring. Imagination would become reality because there's no shadows. So when you see something or hear something, these prisoners who had never experienced anything else would imagine what that thing is in their head, and that would become their truth. And therefore, Gaster could come back into being through memories or something like that. I don't think this is the case anymore. After chapter 3 and 4, Gaster really doesn't seem to be that active of a presence in the world of Deltarune. In the metatextual sense, Gaster is quite active, but in terms of like the actual physical reality of Deltarune, he doesn't seem to be. However, since then, I wanted to go deeper. Yes, darker yet darker. Deeper into this allegory and how it could apply to Deltarune. Because in the 10th anniversary stream for Undertale, a scrapped character from Undertale showed up in the dog hole area of the stream, sort of the Pit of 100 Trials thing. And this character's name was Mr. Sunshine. Now here's some text from Mr. Sunshine, okay? Mr. Sunshine makes shadows and allegorically believes them as real. You confessed that there is a bigger and more real sun outside. Mr. Sunshine believes he is the sun, and so he doesn't care to leave the underground. That is this, right? Casting shadows, this is an allegory, a philosophical allegory. He allegorically believes them as real. You confess there's a real sun outside, just like this picture of the prisoner going and looking at the real sun. Believes he is the sun, so he doesn't care to leave the underground. Underground, cave, it all comes together. And this proves to me something I had already suspected, which is that Toby knows about this. And it leads us an interesting base to sort of go off from when it comes to trying to understand what the point of Deltarune is. So let's go deeper. This is just basically what I just explained. The people walk behind the wall. Their bodies do not cast shadows for the prisoners to see, but the objects that they carry do. The prisoners cannot see what's happening behind them. They're only able to see the shadows cast upon the wall of the cave. The sounds of the people talking echo off the walls, and the prisoners believe these sounds come from the shadows. Socrates suggests the shadows are reality for the prisoners because they have never seen anything else. They do not realize that what they see are shadows of objects in front of a fire, much less that these objects are inspired by real things outside the cave which they have never seen before. I put this here a little bit maliciously, because last time when I made Shadows on the Wall 1, people in the comments said, "You're misunderstanding Plato's allegory." And I kind of just took them at their word because I'm not like, I took a 101 course. I could definitely be wrong. Anyway, this is the Wikipedia summary. It's just a very basic summary of it. And this is exactly what I said in the original video. And so my belief is that we were probably just taught different interpretations of this. I was taught the very simple one. You might have been taught a more complex sort of reading of this. So just, this is here so you take my word for it that this is real, okay? I'm not making this up. Okay, I'm going to read another passage for you. Socrates then supposes the prisoners are released. A freed prisoner would look around and see the fire. The light would hurt his eyes and make it difficult for him to see the objects casting the shadows. If he were told what he is seeing is real, instead of the other version of reality he's seen on the wall, he would not believe it. In his pain, Socrates continues, the freed prisoner would turn away and run back to what he is accustomed to. The light would hurt his eyes, and he would escape by turning away to the things which he was able to look at, and these he would believe to be clearer than what was being shown to him. Boy, that sure does sound like someone we know, right? I mean, that's basically Jevl's whole story. The knight gave Jevl a shadow crystal and explained the truth of his reality to him, and he turned away from that truth, choosing to live in blissful ignorance. Well, okay, maybe less blissful, more forced ignorance. And say that everyone else is actually in a prison, and he's the only one who is truly free. And so I think this passage strongly relates to Jevl. And on its own, that would be, whatever. But Socrates continues. Suppose that someone should drag him by force up the rough ascent, the steep way up, and never stop until he could drag him out into the light of the sun. The prisoner would be angry and in pain, and this would only worsen when the radiant light of the sun overwhelms his eyes and blinds him. This, I think, is a description of Spamton's story. Spamton wanted to see into heaven, right? That's what we hear from him during the Spamton Neophyte. And we do drag him by force by cutting his strings to be able to see this heaven or to gain his freedom, right? And then, what happens when he does gain his freedom? His eyes go dark, as if he has been blinded, and he chooses to give up on getting his own freedom, right? Interesting. All right, so if these two connect to characters in Deltarune, what comes next? Maybe it can connect to a character in Deltarune. Slowly, the prisoner's eyes adjust to the light of the sun. First, he can only see shadows. Interesting. Gradually, he can see the reflections of people. Also interesting. And things in water. Whoa, okay. And then later, see the people and things themselves. Okay, the reason why I am pausing and reacting to this is that reflections is interesting given Deltarune's sort of obsession with copies, right? Everything is a reflection of the prophecy. Ralse is a reflection of Azrael. And it goes on. Trust me, we'll get to that in this video. But it's interesting that first, the prisoner sees reflections. Then, they see people and things in water. Or the reflections of people and things in water. So, okay, we could say things in water is a separate category, perhaps. Water is associated with darkness, the dark fountains, right? The dark fountains are fountains. The roaring is an ocean. So it's being able to see things in water, again, that's very interesting. And then see people and things themselves. So that is the next level, to be actually able to see some sort of real people and not just darkeners or reflections, copies, goners? Very interesting. Anyway, to continue. Eventually, he is able to look at the stars and moon at night, until finally he can look upon the sun itself. Only after he can look straight at the sun is he able to reason about it and what it is. So star is also something that is interesting, because we have the fallen star in Deltarune, which seems to be talking about Des, right? Des is the fallen star. And again, we will dig into this later. And then the sun itself, again, also interesting. If I go back to this representation of the allegory of the cave, you can see the final step of the prisoner's journey is to gaze upon the sun itself, right? However, if we read this as the steps of Deltarune's reality, the sun would represent what? Heaven, right? True reality, the truth, maybe even our world. And so therefore, we could read this as an incremental understanding of Deltarune's reality. First, you can only see shadows, so that's darkners. Gradually, you can see reflections of people and things in the water, which is goners and sort of the dark worlds. Later, you can see people and things themselves. This could be the light world, And eventually, you are able to look at the stars and moon at night. This is interesting, considering where deaths may be. And finally, upon the sun itself, aka the true reality of this world, which is like our reality. So this is sort of like a level of the levels of reality of the world of Deltarune, perhaps. Anyway, there's more. Socrates continues, saying that the free prisoner would think the world outside the cave was superior to the world he experienced in the cave, and attempt to share this with the prisoners remaining in the cave, attempting to bring them onto the journey he had just endured. He would bless himself for the change and pity the other prisoners. He'd want to bring his fellow cave dwellers out of the cave and into the sunlight. So a person who has seen the truth of this world would want to share that truth with others. And what do we know the knight has done? Pass out the shadow crystals to darkners. And in a way, some lighteners, because of course Kris and the gang get their hands on them. And you could count Gerson as a lightener in some ways. But this is very interesting because the knight is, of course, another shadow crystal holder, technically. It's where we get the third shadow crystal from. So therefore, it fits in with this group, right? So what about the final one? Well, we have this passage. The returning prisoner, whose eyes have become accustomed to the sunlight, would be blind when re-entering the cave, just as he was when first exposed to the sun. The prisoners who remained, according to the dialogue, would infer from the returning man's blindness that the journey out of the cave had harmed him, and they should not undertake a similar journey. Socrates concludes that the prisoners, if they were able, would therefore reach out and kill anyone who attempted to drag them from the cave. This might not sound like Gerson to you, but if you really think about it, the knight gave Gerson a chance to escape the cave, right? A shadow crystal to show Gerson the truth of this world. And Gerson did reject it. He took the shadow crystal and just threw it in his drawer. Didn't even have a second thought about it. And to us, we think that's awesome, right? When we're playing the game, because, you know, the knight's our enemy. But viewing it through this lens, it's kind of like willful ignorance, you know? If the knight's goal is simply to free the Darkners from this quote-unquote prison, I mean, Gerson's action isn't necessarily wrong, but it's not, like, good either, right? Especially because he is our mentor character. What does that mean about the story of Deltarune if the character who is teaching us is the one who has rejected the truth? Also, you know, he does destroy the Titan that the knight summoned, and that's probably a good thing, but is it really? Because if the knight has been able to go on this journey and achieve true freedom away from the world of Deltarune, going somewhere else, whether that be the depths or, you know, something else we're not aware of, maybe the knight is just trying to share that with everyone else and isn't so much of a bad guy? That has never happened in a Toby Fox story before, though, so I'm sure we can discount that option, I say sarcastically. Anyway, it also brings another interesting reading to this line that has long been belabored over in the Deltarune theory community. In this land, only eyes blinded by darkness can see the way. This is from chapter 1. It's literally the first thing you read when you enter the Dark World. And now, the most obvious interpretation of this line is that, like, you have to be, like, blinded, right? You have to give in to the shadows or something in order to see the way in the Dark World. However, if we sort of reframe our thinking around the allegory of the cave, whose eyes are blinded by darkness? Not the prisoners, right? Only the returning prisoner whose eyes have become accustomed to the sunlight would be blind when re-entering the cave. And so therefore, you could argue this line could be read as, in this land, only eyes who have seen the truth can see the way. which actually I think makes a little more sense when it comes to the world of Deltarune. Okay, so all of that said, we have to talk about the knight now, right? I mean, I sort of implied it already, but if the knight's goal is to give people freedom, why are they our enemy exactly? And also, who are they? I mean, this is the big obvious mystery that Deltarune has presented us with right now. So if I am going to solve Deltarune, at least try to, I'm going to have to figure out who the knight is, right? In the past, I have professed that Des is the most obvious answer. However, allow me to show you some evidence that we have accumulated from these previous videos, all right? First off, we have Ram. I brought this up a whole lot of times, all right? You're probably bored of hearing it, but in case you haven't heard me talk about it before, in Chapter 3, Ram has a very curious set of dialogue that I think tells us a lot about who the knight can be. So, here's what it says. Time flies. Seems like just yesterday you and that girl had everyone here lined up. Queen on her side, king on your side, Tenna in back. Oh, it was chaos, chaos. Only kids like you two would take a laptop home just to play make-believe. So Kris and an unnamed girl played with the objects that later became Darkners in chapters 1 through 3. The way Ram phrases this, specifically saying it was chaos, chaos, which is of course Jevel's catchphrase, makes it seem like the characters in the Dark World are the same as they were when Kris and this girl were playing this game. Which makes sense, because for Ram to know about this, that means Ram has to be the same as when this game was being played. And this fountain was made by Kris. And so it is clear that Kris and this girl would be the only person who knew these things. In that case, because King and Queen show up in the Dark Fountains before Kris makes theirs in Chapter 3, this really only leaves two people who can be the knight, which is Kris, which doesn't seem to make any sense, or this girl. Which kind of, you know, I mean, I guess technically if you really want to stretch the truth here, you could say that technically doesn't count out Carol, but it basically does, right? Why would Kris be playing this pretend game with Carol? Realistically, it can only be two people, right? It can either be Des or it can be Noelle. And here's the thing, Noelle can't be the knight. She's one of the only characters who we've seen enough to basically rule out the fact that she is the knight. And it would seem like Kris can't be the knight either, right? I mean, Kris and the knight are on the same screen at the same time. So it has to be Des, right? Next, we have to talk about the lighting of the mind. And this goes together with what I was just saying. Basically, the reason I have this here is the fact that when Susie makes a Dark World, it's totally different, right? Not only are the Darkners that exist within the world different, the world itself is different, the colors of the characters are different, it is shaped by her mind, right? There's even a Darkner in this Dark World that says, but the lighting of the mind has changed. At best, you can only see another side. And this is weird, right? Because that means that Kris, who created the Chapter 3 Dark Fountain, and the Knight, who created all the other Dark Fountains, have to have, like, the same lighting of the mind, right? They have to think so similarly that their Dark Worlds are indistinguishable from each other. Otherwise, we would notice little differences in Kris's Dark World. And clearly, like, Toby isn't showing us this for no reason, right? Like, this is a Chekhov's gun, if you're not familiar with the phrase. It basically means this is set up for a later payoff in the story. And so that sort of starts to lead you down a path that seems impossible, right? There's only two explanations. Either Des and Kris have extremely similar minds, or no, that can't be it. Well, the Knight also has a lot of similarities in their actions to Kris. This is something we talked about in the Knight is Fear videos. And this is what led me to believe that the Knight may be representative of fear in some way. Kris, as we know, used to scare and prank Noelle when they were younger. And so perhaps if the red-horned headband is involved in the Knight somehow, like it's one of the objects that has created this weird shadow being, it could explain why the Knight seems to relate to Noelle's fears. It has the antlers of Carol and her katana, seemingly. It has Dessa's bat. It has red energy. It acts like Kris. There's some weird gastery bits, and we know Noelle has sort of peered outside of the bounds of games before, so maybe she's had like nightmares about Gaster that we just haven't heard about yet. And it looks vaguely similar to one of the Titans from Ralsei's prophecy, and we know Noelle is fairly religious, so that kind of makes sense too. And then there's King. Why is King here? Well, one of our major pieces of evidence against Kris being the Knight is that King saw the Knight, like talked to it, seemingly, but also looked at Kris and didn't have any reaction. Unless the two were like conspiring with each other, which really doesn't seem to be the case at this point, surely that means Kris can't be the Knight. Except in chapter 4, King has some dialogue in the prison that completely disregards this idea we held until that point. King says that he never actually met the Knight, and in fact only learned about what the Knight wants and the Knight's sort of being from Jevil. And we know Jevil met the Knight because Jevil got the Shadow Crystal from it. So that casts that piece of evidence completely aside. And actually, I put this here just to represent the idea that all of our criticisms of why Kris couldn't be the Knight in the Chapter 2 theory period kind of got this proven in Chapter 3 and 4. One of our arguments is that Kris would be too weak without the soul to make a Dark Fountain. But, like, they literally do that for Chapter 3. They stuff the soul in the couch and then make the Dark Fountain. But also, they're very active in Chapter 4. They're able to play the piano, which is, not an easy feat if you can barely move your body and are, shuffling around like a zombie without the soul. And it also seemed like way too obvious of a twist at that time. But what if it's a twist within a twist? Because the thing that really drives me to say what I am about to say is the number 9. If you're not too familiar with Undertale, that might be very confusing for you. But 9 is a very significant number. In the same way that Gaster is related to 6 and 666, Kara in Undertale is extremely related to two things: the color red and the number 9, specifically 999. In fact, there's an entire poem written by Azrael in one of the sweepstakes that talks about Kara's obsession with 9s. Here it is. My best friend's number is 9. My best friend's favorite number is 9, sorry. It's because there isn't a number that's higher. 9, 99, 999, 9,999. If everything gets high enough, you become invincible. And there's more. But this sort of proves my point, that 9 is associated with Kara. And 9 is associated with the Knight, because the Knight is the only enemy in Deltarune that, upon defeating you, sends your health to negative 999. The Knight is also associated with red energy. They are associated with freedom. They are associated with knives. You can see it, it's very small probably for you, but the bottom right sprite I have in the Kris comparisons to the Knight shows an unused sprite of the Knight's sword being broken after the clash with Susie, and their sword turns into a very similar looking knife. So am I actually saying what you think I'm saying? Yes, I think the Knight, the whole time, has been Kris. specifically wearing the red horn headband. Now, all right, before you leave your angry comments, okay, or click off the video, let me explain a couple things. First, I don't believe the knight and the Kris that we control are the same person. That's impossible, right? They've been in the same room at the same time. But what if there was another way, something that clears up the strange timing discrepancies that the knight seems to have with creating the dark fountains, and also Kris seems to have at certain points? What if there were two of them? That's right, there's two of them. This shouldn't be the strangest thought, right? I mean, since the very beginning of Deltarune, when we created a vessel, we've presumed that the final fight of Deltarune will be against Kris, or something like that. Because such a core part of the narrative has been our struggle as the player with controlling Kris, and their struggle to gain freedom from our control, right? So the idea that this would come to a head at the end of the game is something that we've been theorizing about since the very first chapter. So what if it's just a little bit bigger than showing up in the final chapter, right? What if there is two Krises playing in the current story? So how would this happen first? Well, if you remember the Goner Maker sequence, you'll remember that at the very end, our vessel gets discarded, right? All of our work discarded. And instead, we are told that you can't choose who you are in this world. Your name is, and then it fades away, and Toriel wakes us up in bed with Kris. So what if, instead of our vessel just being discarded and then we were placed in the body of Kris, what if our vessel was changed to be a copy of Kris? And then that vessel, a copy of Kris, is how we started the game. Because when we look at the other Goners, which remember, this character creation thing is called Goner Maker in the files, the Goners are all copies of their original NPCs, right? I mean, you have the image on the screen here, you can see what I mean. All of them are copies, and all of them are flawed copies. In one way or another, they are different from the original. And sometimes it's as simple as they don't have as much detail, right? Like the bird versus the face Goner. It's literally the exact same thing for the most part, except the face Goner doesn't have all the bird Goner's details. And so, if we are controlling the vessel that has been, shaped to be Kris, and there is another Kris out there, another them, perhaps you could say, then it explains how the knight and why the knight is so Kris-like, despite the fact that Kris, as we know them, can't be the knight. And again, it's not a completely unfounded twist. The first thing that happens in the game is we are told our vessel is discarded, we are now Kris. And since the very beginning, we have been thinking that we will have a confrontation with Kris. It's just, what I'm suggesting is it'll happen in a different way than we originally thought. And here's some evidence to maybe persuade you that I am correct. A line when you are fighting the Titan spawn. When did you start being yourself? You could see this as sort of a generically existential line to go with the sort of uneasy vibe of these fights, but also it could be a line directed specifically at the theme of this game, which is choosing your own self-identity, right? Ralsei is trying to find his own identity away from the idea of being a servant to the Lightners. Susie is trying to find her own identity away from the sort of preconceptions of the town. And Kris, or the vessel Kris, in this case, would be trying to find their own identity away from what they were made to be, which is a replacement for Kris. In the Chapter 4 Egg Room, we get these lines after making the painting and when we go to the sink to wash our hands, right? You ran the water over your hands and dried them. Between your fingers, a faint gray crease glittered stubbornly. You can never wash it all away. Now you can read this, and I think the most obvious reading of this is as a metaphor for trauma, right? You can wash your hands of the events, but there will always be a mark left somewhere, right? That glitters stubbornly. But as we know, copies are monochrome. So this could also be a hint that our version of Kris, the version of Kris we sent into this room, is a goner. That despite everything they've done to try to set themselves up as Kris, to live as Kris as they are supposed to, there's still a difference. They are still a flawed copy, just like the rest of the goners are, right? A faint gray crease. And finally, there is the Shadow Crystal dialogue for when you are alone as Kris. It says, "You thought you saw through your hand." Now, we discussed earlier that the Knight's goal is to lead the Darkners to freedom, right? From their imprisonment in the quote-unquote allegorical cave. Using a Shadow Crystal on their own body, Kris sees through their hand. The Shadow Crystals reveal some element of the truth, right? And so what does it mean if the truth is that Kris doesn't exist? Well, it means that the vessel is not Kris, right? Especially because it's a hand. A hand is the way you interact with the world. Metaphorically, it would make sense that seeing through your hand means that your actions don't really matter. And so as the copy of Kris, this is a way to sort of show the copy that it doesn't matter how much they do to try to be like Kris, they can never actually be a perfect copy, right? They will always be, just an extra. And the reason why I think this works so well for me is that as much as I like the idea of Death Knight, I really like it. It's why I have defaulted to it in most of these videos. Des is clearly this voice in the code, right? I mean, technically, if you believe everything I just said, but don't like the idea of Kris as the Knight because you still like the idea of Des as the Knight too much, you could read these lines as Kris being lost in the code, the true Kris, and then the vessel replace them. Because it has to be someone from the Holiday Dreamer family. Specifically because of two things that get pointed out. One is, in the final one revealed to us in chapter 4, so the fourth paragraph here, has it been days? Hours? If someone told me it'd been years, I might believe them. Now, obviously, this is how long Des has been disappeared for, right? If Kris disappeared at the same time, technically, and then got replaced by the vessel and nobody noticed, then this could also work for them. The second thing is things like breakfast or late night TV. In this place, I don't eat or drink anymore. Obviously, in Chapter 3, the main theme was all about late-night TV. That's what we did before the Dark World got opened. And then, at the beginning of Chapter 4, after that, we have breakfast at the Dreamer house, right? And this specifically, this sort of reference to what's actually going on in the story right now, is what leads me to the conclusion that the person who is talking to us from the code has to be somebody from the Holiday Dreamer family. And really, it can only be someone who doesn't still exist in the world of Deltarune, right? There's no way this could be Noelle, And so, to me, it makes the most sense to be Des. She's the character we know is lost, who we have to find, and so her talking to herself, lost in this void, she literally says, I'm starting to lose track of time. She's lost. That makes the most sense. And therefore, if the other Kris is the Knight, this frees her up to be the person lost in the code. She doesn't also have to be the Knight somehow, and we have to try to rationalize how that could be the case, right? And then we have the conversation about the demon. Now, this came up in the Nightosphere Part 1, I think. It is mentioned sort of by name in Raise Up Your Bat. So, like I said earlier in this video, everything in Deltarune that is like a piece of media seems to be a copy of the prophecy, or based off the prophecy. And so, why don't we try applying that to Raise Up Your Bat as well? Let's go lyric by lyric here. It starts with, when the demon heart is crying. So, the demon heart, obviously you see the word heart, you immediately think of the red soul, right? This is the biggest heart-shaped object, you might say, in the world of Deltarune. And so therefore the demon heart being Kris's soul is really not that strange of an idea, because again, they used to wear devil horns all the time. The next lyric is, and the blood is gushing bright. This probably doesn't matter. I mean, I can't derive any meaning from this anyway. It just seems to be a reference to the fact that the band who wrote this song apparently is called Blood Crushers, so there you go. Raise up your bat for the burning fight. This one's got two interesting parts to it. First is raise up your bat, obviously. We know Death's heavily associated with having a bat as a weapon, but burning fight is also strange. Because in the Chapter 3 Mantle game, we actually have a burning fight inside the shelter. It actually plays to a certain song that's called, oh yeah, Burning Eyes, right? Oh, and whose eyes are those referring to? Right, Kris's eyes, Kris's red eyes. And we have this burning fight with Eram, who is also called Nightmare Boss. This will be important in a second. Eram uses basically exclusively fire attacks, other than, I guess you could argue bombs aren't fire attacks, but I mean, they shoot fire, kind of. And it also summons little mini friends. But that's also kind of interesting for later. Okay, continuing on. When your hope is slowly dying and your future's lost its rights. This seems to be discussing the prophecy, right? Your hope is slowly dying. This could be discussing the last prophecy, where it seems like all hope for the tale is lost. That's literally what it says in the last prophecy. And your future's lost its rights, because of course you can't actually change your destiny because the prophecy is set in stone. Raise up your bat and face the fright. Oh, the fright, you say. So once again, we have raise up your bat repeated, but face the fright is extremely interesting, considering, like I could go through the slides again, but I don't think I need to. Kris is associated with fear, right? The two aspects of Kris's personality are an avatar of fear and courage. Kris has courage as a power all the time, and of course courage is sort of bravery in the face of fear, right? So raise up your bat to face the fright. We've already been saying that this burning fight with the demon heart crying, it sounds like we are fighting Kris. And now we have face the fright. And again, Kris associated heavily with being scary or, associated with people's fears. And finally, let's knock him dead into the night, which probably doesn't mean anything, although the dark worlds are sometimes equated to like night. Specifically, there is the song at the end of Chapter 4 that plays called Never Ending Night, which I guess could talk about the roaring, which would make sense, because I think this can lead us to a correct interpretation of who Eram is meant to represent. Because, as I mentioned in this original video, everything in the Mantle game is like a metaphor, right? The white cloak, for example, this is the obvious one everyone immediately picked up on, is supposed to be Noel, but it's never actually called Noel. It's called the white cloak. Similarly, we had like the bluebird for Birdly, and it seems like the area we go through right before we go to the shelter to fight Eram is based on hometown. I talked about this in my new hometown theory video, but many other people have talked about this as well. And so the idea of this character that we fight in the shelter being foreshadowing for a character we will fight later in the game only makes perfect sense, right? So let's run down what we know about this character. Well, they're a burning fight. They can use fire magic. Somebody is raising up their bat to fight them, so it can't be Death's, right? They have the demon heart is involved somehow, and they are called a fright. So yes, what I'm essentially saying is that Eram, or Nightmare Boss, again, nightmares being scary things that sort of haunt you, Eram is a representation of Kris, because again, the Dreamer family is associated with fire magic. Now, Kris, not a full dreamer, right? Not a monster, so can't use magic, presumably. Although I wouldn't be surprised if that tradition gets broken at some point in Deltarune, because we were explained it at the very beginning, so you'd probably expect some sort of breakdown of that as the story goes on. However, the burning fight could also be sort of symbolic of Kris's burning eyes, right? The sort of determination that burns in them. So instead of it being literal fire as it is represented in the Mantle game, it could be like metaphorical fire, as in determination or willpower. And if Eram is meant to represent a final battle with Kris, the real Kris, presumably in this case, then it really recontextualizes the lines that Eram says to our Kris, to Vessel Kris, right? So let me read that to you, and then we'll go over what I think it might all mean. Kris. Oh, Kris. Is it fun, Kris? Playing around like this? That's why you're searching for them, aren't you? The shadow crystals and the shadow mantle that I'm holding. Do you honestly think it'll get you what you want? No. Part of you is just enjoying this, isn't it? The same part of you that enjoyed yesterday, knowing you could say it wasn't really you. Oh, don't make that sour face. I can see in the dark, you know. The question is, can you? There's two very important things to take from this. One is the idea that this is the true Kris, right? The Kris who used to make fun of Noelle all the time and sort of enjoyed being scary, right? Asking their replacement if they feel the same way. You're just enjoying this, aren't you? Just like I used to, so it's fine. The way I used to act was fine because you're acting the same way. It's sort of it's a projection onto Vessel Kris, saying like, you and I are copies of one another. You can't be different from me, because that means that I am personally responsible for the bad things that I did, right? We have to be the same. Our circumstances are the same, therefore, if you are not the same sort of mean person I used to be, then that means something's wrong with me. The second part that is important is the line, I can see in the dark, you know, can you? Because that kind of shoots a big hole in everything I've been saying so far, right? Doesn't it? My whole point was that Kris is the knight, and the knight is someone who has seen the truth. Therefore, they would be blind in the dark world because they have seen the sun in the whole allegory, right? But this is Eram, who is a representation, in my opinion, of the true Kris, saying that they can see in the dark, which means they therefore haven't seen the truth. How can that make sense? Well, I have an explanation. But in order for you to understand it, we first have to talk about Des again. So there is a book in Chapter 4 that you can find on a random bookcase that has a little poem. And I'm going to break down all the coded language here for you so you can understand what it is saying in sort of the terms of the themes of Deltarune, right? So it goes like this. And so wept the fallen star, making rivers with its tears. Then, slowly, from the bitter water something grew. It looked like glass. So you can see I have a bunch of text here breaking everything down. So I'm going to try to go through this really quickly so we don't get bogged down in this, okay? The fallen star is almost undoubtedly Des. Des wanted to be a rock star. She had her guitar, right? Des's room is also covered in stars. Her comforter is covered in stars. She has the little glowing stars like the ones in Asriel's bedroom. In fact, you could maybe take the implication that that's where Asriel got those stars in his bedroom from, considering she has more of them and it makes more sense for her. Making rivers. Okay, so we talked about how there's a lot of water symbology when it comes to the dark world. The roaring is likened to an ocean. The dark fountains are springs of water, right? They are fountains shooting out water. And so in that metaphor, a river would be a path from a dark fountain to the roaring, because a river's purpose in the water cycle is to carry water from a spring to the ocean, right? And so therefore, this is sort of metaphorically meaning it's some sort of path from a dark fountain to the roaring. With its tears, then slowly from the bitter water something grew. In other words, from the tears something grew that looked like glass. And the shadow crystals specifically are said to look like glass, in quotes there, because that's important. Sometimes they're called the glass or whatever, but they are one of the only objects in Deltarune to say they look like glass. The other one being, of course, the black shard. So both related to the night anyway. So if we were to rephrase this without all of the coded language, we could say, and so wept Des, making a new path to the roaring with her tears, the shadow crystals. So in this sort of dialogue, what we can get is that Des has made a new path. Like, she has cut a new path other than the prophecy to get to the roaring with the shadow crystals. And so that suddenly kind of makes sense, right? Because, again, the knight is sort of on the same level as like Jevil or Spamton in this allegory. The knight doesn't necessarily have to be like the all-knowing person who's seen all of the truth. The knight could just be someone who got a shadow crystal and has sort of said to themselves, I know now the truth, and instead of hiding from it or being blinded by it or ignoring it, they have decided to take action on it, right? And try to free others by using these shadow crystals. And so you could make the case that Des's role in this story is entering the depths and somehow messing with the game and creating an alternate path, right? And then Kris, as the knight, is acting on this alternate path somehow by giving the shadow crystals out to try to free people from the prophecy. The shadow crystals represent freedom after all, right? Continuing. The roaring seems to be some sort of biblical flood type event. Like we said, it's been reckoned to an ocean before, but there's more, okay? So I'm going to read some of this stuff for you. The Forgotten Man, in Chapter 3, has a line that says, the earth was covered in water, dinosaurs appeared, an ice age. Actually, there are still dinosaurs. Is it mixed up? So we could kind of presume the way this should go, right? Dinosaurs appeared, that being Susie comes to town. The earth was covered in water, that being the roaring occurs, and then an ice age. I sort of talked about this during the water and glass video, but to sum it up really quickly, the prophecies are constantly referred to as being like glass, well, literally glass. The shadow crystals are like glass, and the prophecy panels are glass, right? The truth is written in glass, in fact, is something said about them. And so, water is sort of related to creation, right? The dark fountains are ever-changing. They are like water. Glass is completely stationary. It is the truth. It is what will happen no matter what. And so you could view ice as being water, so something we've created that now we are making an inevitability. We are making the truth. So you could read this as, Susie appeared, we get to the roaring, and then using ice somehow, boy, I wonder who could have ice powers we could use, we are able to create something new. A new truth, even, you could say. All right, continuing. These are some more lines from Raise Up Your Bat. In fact, they come right after what we just were talking about. Come follow me into the dark with your heart as the arc which shall shine you the way. Because I'm with you in the dark with your heart as my mark which shall guide you the way through the waves. Waves, again, ocean sort of symbology going on. But arc is the important word to take here. Your heart as the arc. Really, you can only read this as Des singing to Kris, right? Follow me into the dark, as in Des has been lost in the dark somehow, and Kris is going to follow her. With your heart as the arc, because the red soul is able to sort of guide you through the darkness somehow, it'll shine you the way. Des is with us in the dark because she's been lost in the depths or whatever, which means she's kind of like within the game's code almost, in the same way Gaster is kind of with us all the time. With your heart as my mark, we were talking about earlier how it seems like the person who is raising up their bat is going to fight Kris, so your heart as my mark isn't that strange of a lyric, which shall guide you the way through the waves. Again, arc is the most important part here. The idea that there is some way to sort of survive the biblical level flood that the roaring is, and to take other people with you. Speaking of, there's Susie's lines, this is on the right of the slide now, during the cafe sort of meetup in chapter 4 when it's raining, right? She says, "And now I'm saying shut up, and then the rain fell down and washed everything away." Again, this is just further foreshadowing that the roaring is like a biblical flood type thing. And what about Pluie? Put on your shoe, hey, and sprint. It's raining cats and cats. Cats is also a weird thing. Bring chosen ones to the ark. Oh God, here's ark being mentioned again. Bring the chosen ones to the ark. Well, I guess that's how that works, right? I mean, the story of Noah, which is where the ark comes from, only 2 of each animal was brought on, not everybody. Uh-oh. And then finally, I have the line, police sacrifice next week. The comment at the bottom is from the original video. It's more or less just to give credit of the idea of all of this and helping me put it together, by the way. Just so it doesn't go unmentioned. We don't really know what they're going to do to Undyne. What sacrifice could it be? But I think, given everything that's surrounding this, it probably has something to do with the ark. So this is my slide all about Des and her personality. In the original video, which I believe is the Nightosphere Part 1, I sort of lay out how I personally am reading into Des's room, right? She's got all of this junk in the corner that's dented, and it's expensive stuff, but she's not really taking care of it. And you can read this 2 ways, right? You can either read this as like Des is a careless person who doesn't really care about her things, or you can read this as Des doesn't care about this stuff because it doesn't really appeal to her, right? I mean, if we look at this pile, we've got maybe a drumstick, maybe like a recorder. It's kind of hard to tell what's underneath that microphone. We've got a violin and a flute and roller skates and hockey pucks maybe, and then like a cracked, broken bat, which may be the wiffle bat that they used to hit Kris with, by the way. We don't know, but it is a bat after all. So my reading of all of this junk is that Des is the black sheep of her family, right? This is almost assured to be true at this point. I mean, her door is literally black. And she's been talked about as like a rebel, right? Someone who's into punk music and rock videos and horror movies, all this stuff that she's not supposed to be watching or listening to, right? Her most favorite thing in the world is a guitar, after all. And so you could take it as, you know, Carol is a very controlling person at the very least, and Rudy doesn't really seem to be doing anything to stop her from being very controlling. And so you could have this situation that I could very easily foresee of Des being like, "Hey mom, I want to be a rock star." And Carol going, "No, you don't. Here, look, I'm not going to stifle your interest in music. If you want to, you know, be a musician, that's fine. But you have to be a respectable musician, you know? The kind of musician that I would like you to be." And therefore she buys her a violin or a grand piano, which Noelle says they have for some reason, but nobody ever plays. Well, maybe that's why. And a flute, all of these like respectable classical instruments. But of course, you know, Des wants to play the guitar. She wants to be a punk rocker. And And similarly with like the bat, right? We've got this stuff under Des's bed, army rations, guitar picks, paintball gear, ice skates. So you could see this as, okay, the army rations and the paintball gear, this could be like, you know, closer to extreme sports. And then she was given a bat and said, play baseball instead. We don't want you doing paintball, play baseball. Guitar picks to represent the music thing we just talked about. And then ice skates. I find it very funny that the Holiday family might not want Des to learn ice skating, but it seems like it could be hockey specifically she was into, considering the hockey pucks and all that. And they have roller skates in this pile instead. Like maybe they were worried about like the sharp blades. Carol seems like the kind of person who would worry about that, right? Like she won't even let Noelle cook for herself. We learn in the Weird Route that like she forgot to make Noelle a pre-prepped meal and is coming home right away to do so instead of allowing her to cook anything. And so the idea that she might be, you know, scared of blades on the skates and is like, here, try rollerblading instead. That's just kind of funny to me. But all of this put together sort of paints the picture that Des doesn't really get to choose what she does in her life, right? She goes up and says, I want to do this. And her parents say, well, no, but you could do this thing we want you to do that's kind of related. And I think this all goes along with the few other things we know about her. One, she calls herself Des, right? I mean, she's only very rarely referred to as December. Rudy and Noelle all refer to her as Des. And Kris, in this case, too, says it's Des's bed, right? She also calls Noelle Ellie. Both of these nicknames just so happen to take away the holiday theming from the sisters' names, which could imply, of course, that she kind of wants to distance herself from her family. Which wouldn't be surprising, considering Noelle talks about Des promising to take her away to the big city someday, which really sounds like Des's way of telling a child that she wants to run away from home with her. Right? And this would also make sense why people in the town aren't that upset about her disappearance. Most of them probably see it as like, oh yeah, well, she ran away from home, and we haven't found her yet because she doesn't want to be found. You don't get to choose who you are in this world is a very particular line. If it sounds familiar and you don't remember where it is, I mean, I mentioned it earlier, so you probably do. It's the line that interrupts the Gonnermaker sequence. And now we believe it is an interruption because in the Japanese text, it uses different sort of emphasis. It's hard for me to explain because I don't know what I'm talking about, but I will take the word of people who do know what they're talking about and say that it's kind of off. It's a little different. Gaster speaks in a very proper way because, of course, he does. He's a scientist. The person who says you don't get to choose who you are in this world speaks in a rather improper way, almost a rude way. And that would make sense for Des, right? So, if Des got lost in the depths, which is the same place Gaster is and the same place the Gonnermaker sequence takes place, it would make sense that she could be the one that is interrupting that sequence and saying you don't get to choose who you are in this world and accidentally making a copy of Kris. Because she's kind of, again, I've said this before, but the depths in the code seem to be one and the same, right? Gaster speaks to us from the code, the unused dialogue is in the code. So the fact that she's like messing around in the depths without really knowing what she's doing, that could have effects on the actual game. That could manifest as like the shadow crystals, for example, or again, interrupting the Gonnermaker sequence and accidentally turning the vessel into a copy of Kris. So the one thing we haven't talked about in all of this is, okay, if Des is the person lost in the code and Kris is the knight, what is Gaster's role in this story? Well, to me, it only makes sense that Gaster, in terms of the allegory of the cave, right, is Plato. Gaster is the person who made this whole place. His goal is just to observe. He is a scientist. He didn't make the world of Deltarune for any ulterior motive. He isn't trying to reassemble himself and re-enter the world. I think he's maybe even quite content being outside the world of the actual games and being able to observe them as they happen and make his little notes. And so this whole conundrum, the prophecy, deaths being lost, the heroes, the copies, this is all just interesting science to him. In the same way, Plato's allegory was just a way to express his thoughts, right? This world is just a way for Gaster to express himself. To us, the player. Because at the end of the day, Gaster is a stand-in for Toby, at least when it comes to Deltarune. So of course, his goal would be to share his cool ideas with us, because that's what Toby wants, right? But once again, in order to get to the final conclusion, we have to dig a little deeper. And this is where we finally get to Gallery. So, in the original Gallery video, I broke down this prophecy into 3 parts. One is the angel, essentially. Now, you can argue, well, that's not the angel, it doesn't have wings. It's like, okay, that's fair. My counterpoint would be the wings would take up too much space on this prophecy, and also it would make the metaphor too obvious, right? This is supposed to be cryptic. You can see in the last prophecy that the angel is bisected in the same way that the head of this figure is bisected in the Gallery prophecy. It's not perfect, but it makes enough sense that these two are one in the same. The idea that after the last prophecy, when the angel's heaven is destroyed, or, I don't know, we are somehow severed from the world of Deltarune, that we will enter this space, does kind of make sense, given that the middle seems to be 2 portraits. Really, all these can represent, in my opinion, are the light world and the dark world. 2 worlds, right? And if we view the person in the middle as being a viewer of the gallery, that means the paintings are in front of them, almost like the screen is in front of us as the player. And finally, at the very back of the mural that we are seeing here is these curtains. And in the negative space, you can kind of see a familiar shape forming, can't you? That's right, the shape of friend. So the basic idea would be we, as the player, are viewing the 2 worlds of Deltarune, the light world and the dark world. We exist in quote-unquote heaven, in the angel's heaven, in reality. And beneath the light and dark world of Deltarune, there is something else, a void of shadow, the place where friend resides, the depths. Now, we can map these realities onto the allegory of the cave fairly well, right? As I said before, the darkners appear to be the shadows on the wall, right? They are casted figures that are not real, but they are based on the ideas of reality. The lighteners, therefore, would be the prisoners. They go to the dark world and see the shadows, but they have never seen the true reality of their world, right? And in a way, despite the fact that the darkners are even less real than the prisoners are, they are both prisoners of the cave, right? The shadows don't get to leave the cave either. And so we can view them as somewhat equal in that sense. They are both prisoners of the cave. Beyond the wall, that the prisoners cannot see past, is the depths. This represents the game's code, and the people who are holding these sort of, I don't know what to call them, puppets, I guess. These puppeteers that are creating the shadows, it's a representation of the code of the game of Deltarune. The code is what makes everything we see in the light world and the dark world, both the prison that we allegorically call the cave in this allegory, are functions of the code itself. And so we can view these puppets and the puppeteers as being these functions of the code. Beyond that is true reality, our reality, the angel's heaven. The heaven that Spamton was trying to reach, a place where you can see true freedom, where you are no longer bound by the puppeteering of the code, right? Where all of your choices are your own. And so, I think we could represent this on an interesting sort of graph. I call it horseshoe reality theory. Because, going back to this for a second, the Darkners and the Lightners are on different levels, right? The Darkners are even less real than the Lightners are. However, they are both prisoners of the cave. The Puppeteers, however, are not. The Puppeteers can leave whenever they want. They are on the same level of truth as the people who have seen the sun, right? They know that the shadows are not real, and they know that the people in the cave are prisoners. They are not chained to the cave. They can leave whenever they want. And therefore, you can view the depths as being just as real as our reality, which makes sense because the code is something tangible in our reality. It is real. Where Kris is a representation of code and therefore is not real, the code itself that represents Kris is real. The problem, however, is that us in heaven, most of us players, we can't look at the code and read it, right? We can't just say like, okay, this function, I understand exactly what it means. I love this function as if it was a character. Of course we don't. That's not how our brains work. And so we need a connection to be able to understand the depths or the code. And Gaster has created this connection for us. In order for us to understand Gaster and what he wants to show us, we need the world of Deltarune, a connection, which is less real than the code, but it is able to be understood by both parties, the people who operate from within the code and the people who operate outside of it. So that's where the horseshoe comes in, right? On one tip of the horseshoe is us in heaven, in true reality. On the other end is the code, also existing in true reality, but being even more obscure than the light or dark world to us, and therefore being quote unquote deeper than it. And in the middle, where the two meet at the bottom, is something that is less real, but more comprehensible to both parties. And that is the world of Deltarune. And that, I believe, is why Gaster has created the world of Deltarune. It's so he can share his thoughts with us and see how we react to them. He's basically a reaction YouTuber, but he's actually a scientist who is sort of testing us to see what our reaction to his test will be. And so we can fill in some slots here. For one, we know Friend is a being within the world of Deltarune who somehow represents the depths, right? When we had the gallery prophecy before, Friend represented the depths. Friend is associated with sixes, with the tale of hell. Hell is another name for the depths. And so Friend, for some reason, is associated with the depths. And this kind of makes sense. I kind of brushed over it earlier, but Eram is able to summon Friend, right? And we talked about how Eram metaphorically represents Kris as the knight. If Kris is the true Kris, and that's where the red horn headband went, the red horn headband would be a perfect candidate for being Friend in the Dark World. So the idea that the knight has like a familiar that they can send out at any time, that's kind of fun. And it's like a representative of the depths and the whims of the depths, which is Des trying to control everything, right? Trying to change fate. Noelle, therefore, is sort of the representation of heaven or the angel. Something people bring up, which I think is valid, is that while the player is explicitly linked to the angel through Chapter 4, when the angel doll literally falls on us and we can control it as the player, Noelle has a lot of associations with the angel too, right? There's that whole dialogue about snow angels and the Spamton sweepstakes. Spamton calls her Angel in Chapter 2 if you do the weird route. She's wearing a white cloak. She's sort of strung up like a biblical figure by Queen. I think we could view her in the same way as Friend is a representation of the depths. Noelle is a representation of heaven, as far as that makes any sense in the world of Deltarune. That's why Noelle is constantly seeing little glimpses into true reality. She's like, if we were to view it in the allegory, right? She's a prisoner in the cave, but the brick behind her is like loose and it falls out sometimes. And the people have to keep putting it back in. But when it has fallen out, the light can leak through and Noelle can see it. And she can't really figure out what's really going on, but she can, she knows there's something else out there. And I think that's why she represents what she does. In the middle of all of this is the knight. The knight serves the whims of a certain person who exists within the depths, and I believe they control Friend in order to help them spy on the Lightners, right? The heroes. They directly oppose us. However, they also need us, because we are part of the prophecy too. And if their goal is to have the roaring happen, I mean, if they've talked to someone from the depths, they know that the prophecy will happen. So they need us in the same way we kind of need them for the story to keep happening. If we destroy the knight in the Snowgrave route, then the prophecy's all screwed up, right? Because the heroes are supposed to fight with the knight strife by strife. That's what the prophecy says. On the far end of the spectrum, the person who we are actually fighting against in the main route of Deltarune is Des. And that might seem strange to you, because I think all of us, including myself, have had this feeling that the person we've been fighting against all this time is Gaster, right? That this is a big game of chess and we're just moving our players from one end of the board to the other. But if Gaster is a neutral observer, if Gaster is watching us from the background to see how we will react, then he shouldn't be involved in the game at all, right? Otherwise, he's interfering with his science-y test results. And so I think the person who is opposing us in this world, I suppose you could say, is Des. Because Des wants to break the prophecy, whereas in the main route, we are following the prophecy. If we want to be on the same side as Des, we have to do Snowgrave. And I don't think she's going to be very happy with the results. Because here's the thing. Des can create the shadow crystals and try to give people freedom. But by giving us freedom, the only thing we can do is hurt Noelle. So either way, I feel like we are going to be opposed to Des. Either we're going to do the main route, which is we don't do the shadow crystals and sort of break the prophecy, and therefore we are diametrically opposed to what she wants, or we are going to do sort of her way, quote unquote, and break the prophecy and create something even worse, where now Noelle is hurt, the person she cares about the most. All that to be said. Now I get to tell you a story. We've set up all the background, so let me just tell you how I think the events of Deltarune played out in the past and to the present, okay? It's story time, everyone. So, we start at the beginning. Des discovers the Dark Worlds in the shelter. I think there's fairly good evidence that Des was hanging out in the shelter. It makes sense that's where she got those army rations from, for example. Where else would she have gotten those? And so she discovers the Dark World and is immediately in love with it, right? In the same way that in Chapter 2, people like Burley are like, this world's just better. Why don't we just stay here all the time? Des is someone who is feeling very constrained by her daily life, by her family. She already wanted to run away, but she didn't have the resources. Now she can just walk to the south side of her own town and enter this completely new world where she seems to have awesome powers and can do whatever she wants. And eventually, maybe the first thing, but eventually anyway, she decides she wants to share this world with her friends. The only three, I guess she's one of the three people she cares about in this city. The problem is, only one of her friends will join her. Azrael won't go in the shelter because he doesn't want to break the law. Now, law might be a little bit of a harsh word for this, but people aren't allowed in the shelter, right? It's dangerous. And maybe that sort of stipulation was put there after Des disappeared. That's fair to assume. But at the same time, we know that Asgore had some sort of security code originally. And I personally believe that Asgore's fault and why he's taken the blame for Des's disappearance is because he let that code slip, right? That's why he was fired from the police force. But why Carol is still willing to work with him because he's obsessed about the case. And so Azriel doesn't want to enter the shelter because he doesn't want to break the rules, and Noelle won't enter because she's too scared. Kris, on the other hand, totally willing to go along with it. And so Kris and Des enter the shelter together. Now, something happens. Kris loves the dark world because Kris and Des actually do have a lot in common. They're both the black sheeps of their family, and although they often butt heads, they both are suffering from similar problems, right? People have preconceived notions of how they should live their lives, and they don't get to act the way that they feel like they want to. However, they're also, like I said, butting heads all the time. So one way or another, something happens and Des is lost to the depths. My personal thought, in terms of what we've seen so far, is that maybe Des fell into the dark fountain itself. That's the only way I could see you entering the depths, because a dark fountain is kind of like opening a hole into another layer of reality, right? So if you fell into that, maybe you'd end up in the depths. One way or another, she ends up there, because that's where we see the unused dialogue from her. That makes the most sense. Personally, I think what might have happened, here's my thought, okay? Kris is characterized as a person who cares about inanimate objects, specifically like Ram, right? Ram is just a plug, but it's a plug that doesn't work, and so Kris relates to that plug as being an outcast and makes it like their favorite toy that they play with all the time. Des, however, doesn't treat objects very well. She tosses them aside, right? Unless she's particularly attached to them. So I think a conflict could have arisen in the dark world between the two when Kris sees how Des treats the Darkners. Because again, we know the Knight wants to free the Darkners from their prison in the dark world. Just like Susie kind of does, right? So I guess you could make the argument it could be the other way around. But bottom line, I think the two fought. And I think this is sort of a simulation of the burning fight that is supposed to happen during the prophecy. Des raised up her bat against Kris, just like she would in the light world. However, in the dark world, it's a much different story. Kris has the red soul and determination, and the real knife or something, who knows. And at the end of the day, Kris defeats her, and it ends up with Des lost in the depths. So now a lot of bad stuff is happening. Des is inside the depths, the code of the game, and slowly but surely goes through the steps we mentioned before of coming to understand true reality. She struggles with it at first, and eventually overcomes those struggles and understands what the depths are and what it means. And I believe that the unused dialogue is a log of her journey through this. She starts off scared and unable to do anything, but slowly she starts to be able to calm down and ration about what's going on in her life, right? And here's the thing. Deltarune's sense of time isn't real, right? It's controlled by the code. Each day only passes when you reach certain milestones. That's how a game works. And so I don't think the depths has time. And this is very important. And it's actually mentioned in the unused dialogue, right? Has it been days, hours, years? The depths doesn't have the same level of time that the world of Deltarune does. Therefore, as soon as Des falls into the depths, it's almost as if she goes through this whole journey in an instant. She becomes like omnipotent, almost, you could say. She is everything and nothing. Because she is a part of the controlling factors of the game and the code. As soon as Des ends up falling into the depths, however that happens, Kris is left alone and panicking, because of course they are. They didn't actually want to hurt her, right? But they don't know what the rules of this world are either. This is the first time they've ever been there. And so they are kind of freaking out. Eventually, Azriel gets worried and calls Asgore for help. Now we introduce the vessel. So, Des is fooling around in the code. She doesn't really understand what she's looking at, but she's trying to find Kris, because of course she is. That's where she last left off, right? Was with Kris. And in doing so, she accidentally interrupts the Goner Maker sequence. At the same time, Asgore breaks into the shelter, searching for Des and Kris. He thinks he sees Kris, again after the Goner Maker sequence gets interrupted, and grabs them, exiting with the vessel and dragging it out into the light. Then shutting and locking the shelter to make sure nothing else can happen. This traps Kris in the dark world. Because as we know, when you lock a door in the dark world, again, this is another Chekhov's gun that is firing, that door in the dark world becomes inaccessible. And so Kris now has no means to escape the shelter. This is another big one. It's 2 parts, that's why. So, eventually, again, this would almost seem like no time at all, Des finds a way to contact the real Kris, who she finds is now trapped in the dark. She reveals to Kris, perhaps through the shadow crystals, maybe they don't even necessarily talk, but Kris receives the shadow crystals and learns the truth of their reality. Now this is important. Kris has never actually seen the depths. Kris has never been to the depths. And that's why I think Kris can still see in the dark, as Eram suggests, right? Kris has never actually gone on this journey themselves. They are they're working for Des, again, also symbolically makes sense, seems how a knight usually serves a noble or a king or a queen, right? They are working for Des, trying to free everyone in the world of Deltarune with the shadow crystals that she created inside of the code. In other words, she's essentially coded a new path into the game from her position inside of it. And slowly but surely accepts Des's plan to cause the roaring, which will destroy Hometown. But that's actually kind of a good thing, right? Like, yeah, on the surface, the idea that like, yeah, we want to destroy the world. Obviously, that sounds bad. But in reality, this world is a prison, and everyone inside of it is living sort of a simulated reality. It's like the Matrix, right? Which, by the way, another basic philosophical concept or argument that we talk about in Philosophy 101 is matrix theory. And if you're curious, the end of that is to basically say like, oh yeah, you think we're in the Matrix? Go jump off a cliff then, buddy. That's how it ended in my class anyway. I digress. So now Kris is on board with starting the roaring. Problem is, they can't leave the shelter. At the same time, the vessel is taken in for psychiatric care. And the dreamers think that the child's lack of memories and their odd behaviors are a result of the trauma that occurred inside of the shelter. And so Kris is sent to the art therapy thing we see mentioned in Chapter 4's Egg Room. And it is here that, quote unquote, Kris is born. Because the therapist, in trying to get Kris to remember who they are, is essentially coaching them to become like the original Kris. And the vessel, I mean, who knows what its mind is like, right? Being created whole cloth as a teenager, or actually, I guess it would be a child, because that was the age Kris would be when they disappeared, and told, like, you should be these things. You are the child of the Dreamer family. You like playing pranks. You like doing all these other things. And slowly, you could even view this as metaphorically coloring the vessel to become more like Kris, in the sense that, you know, they are coloring Kris's perceptions of the world in the way you would use that word. So, the real Kris eventually returns to Hometown. I think there's 2 ways this could happen. One, it is through Asgore's desperation to find Des that Asgore reopens the shelter, and this is what allows Kris to go free. The other option is they just become so strong in the dark world that they're able to travel like Ralsei. And then after the closet fountain is opened, or something like that, they are able to escape the dark world that way. That's what I mean by see in the dark in this description. But eventually, Kris is able to escape the shelter world, and they find that it has been years, although for them, it's been even longer, because that's how time in the dark world works. It's longer than in the light world, so that sucks. Anyway, they notice how much the town has changed, but no one seems to bat an eye at their return. Whereas it seems like Des's disappearance has gone more noticed, which must suck. Like, without knowing what's actually going on, Kris just views a world where everything works fine without them. Where have I heard that before? Anyway, they go back home and go up to their bedroom, and then everything is finally sort of making more sense as they see themselves sleeping in their own bed. So, the two Krises come to an understanding and work out a plan. You see, Vessel Kris doesn't really have any direction in life. They don't really know who they are or what they're supposed to do. So when the real Kris shows up and gives them a role in life, they are completely willing to accept it without question. And I think this is represented by Kris's otherwise lack of any interesting objects in their bedroom, right? So, the original Kris will serve the role of the villain in the prophecy, the Knight, and create the dark fountains in such a way the roaring is sure to come to pass, right? They are essentially using the prophecy as an instruction booklet in order to cause the roaring. The vessel then will serve Kris's original role as the first hero, seems that they are a copy of Kris. Now they just need to figure out who's going to fill the other two slots. And I think this is kind of funny, considering Ralsei's version of the roaring has 3 titans in it, right? 2 sort of wiry titans that look like the Knight, and 1 that's a more traditional looking titan with like horns. And you could maybe view this as like an abstraction of what's actually going on here, which is there are 2 Krises, so 2 knights, quote unquote, and then a third more powerful being that is actually controlling them, which would be Des in the depths. Now we get the creation of Ralsei. You see, the original story used Azriel and Noelle as these other heroes. Des is gone, but again, Noelle is an extra hero for a reason. She can be subbed in if the player of the game so wishes. The problem, of course, is that both of these options have their own issues. Azriel is away at college right now, so we can't use him unless we want to wait, which we desperately do not want to. It's not how the game works, right? It has to progress through these days. And the other problem is, the last prophecy states the girl with hope crossed on her heart must be sacrificed. Now this is something I didn't mention before this, but I do believe it to be true. I'm going to bring up the picture right now. So in the last prophecy, along with the angel being bisected, you can see that one of the triangles is broken as well, the one on the left. Now, in Ralsei's castle town, this left triangle that is pointing upwards is pink. Obviously, that means this triangle is meant to represent Susie, considering the colors of the other 2. Putting this together, if the last prophecy is actually meant to be taken literally, and the angel and this triangle on the left are going to be destroyed or damaged during the last prophecy, then it makes sense that the girl with hope crossed on her heart is going to be destroyed during the last prophecy. And therefore, Susie, who plays that role in our current party, is the one who will, of course, fill that role. Kris will not allow Noelle to fill that role, obviously. Noelle is very important to Des and also them. As much as they might torment her, they still care about her. And so, we need to fill these two roles with somebody else. Well, one is by creating a Darkner that is like Azriel, probably formed from something related to Azriel. In my other videos, I speculated Ralsei might be the green crayon for a number of reasons. You can go back and watch that video if you want to know why. That could make sense, or it could be anything else. And now, they just need to fill the role of the girl with hope crossed on her heart. So they need to find somebody in town who they are okay with sacrificing. And that is, of course, Susie. Nobody cares about Susie, not even her own parents. Also, she's bullying Kris. So of course, that is the pick they choose. So, Ralsei is briefed on the plan, and just like the vessel, being given purpose after being born with like no understanding of what their role in life is supposed to be, Ralsei sort of just infers that a Darkener's role is to serve the Lighteners, and so he joins along with their mission. This also explains all of Ralsei's strange knowledge, right? Why does Ralsei know Susie and Kris's names? Because that's the plan. Why does Ralsei know the prophecy? They told it to him. That's the plan. And why is he constantly having sidebars with Vessel Kris? Because they're working together on the plan. I don't even think that's too crazy. Like, that's something most of us have sort of figured out at this point too, right? That Kris and Ralsei are working together on something we don't quite understand yet. And to my knowledge, this would make the most sense to me. So, step 12. Deltarune begins, and the events play out as they have so far in your save file. However, there is one problem. Vessel Kris and Ralsei are starting to form their own identities as they go on this adventure, which was not the plan, right? They were supposed to just fill their roles in the prophecy to the best of their abilities, but now they're starting to think for themselves. And worse, they start to really like Susie. So we reach this dilemma, right? Where originally, True Kris and Vessel Kris and Ralsei and Des are all in on this together, right? They're all working together to this goal to free the Light World and the Dark World residents from their prison. But now, half of the contingent, Ralsei and Vessel Kris, are actually playing their roles in the prophecy as the heroes who want to save the world, which means preserving the prison for the sake of saving Susie's life, right? Which means Kris, the true Kris, who is playing the role of the knight, who originally was just doing it for fun, has now actually become the villain from the prophecy. They are actually opposed to what the heroes want. It's almost like the prophecy is like some sort of self-fulfilling thing that's always true, no matter what you do. Weird. And I think this solves Eram's weirdly sort of mean-spirited dialogue with Vessel Kris, right? Like, if the two Krises are working together, why is Vessel Kris being so pedantic toward them? Well, it's because they're starting to get big for their britches, right? They're starting to try to form their own identity. And this is Kris trying to knock that down a few pegs and say, no, you're just like me, remember? So do what I say, copy of me. And visualize this is what that all looks like. Noelle is the extra hero. Des and Kris are aligned in this sort of red alliance, which is the I guess Des Alliance, you could call it, with Vessel Kris and Ralsei. Vessel Kris, Susie, and Ralsei are all aligned as the Delta Warriors. And then Noelle isn't in on any plans, and Carol and Asgore are both working together as adults to try to figure out what actually happened to their children way back when in the shelter. The question might become for you, how are we going to get all of this explained to us, right? Like, this is so much backstory. The characters aren't just going to sit us down and be like, this is what happened, in the same way I just did, right? You have to tell this in a dramatic way. And so this is where I bring up New Hometown again. The idea that Chapter 5 will be based on a copy of Hometown. Now, the reason I believe this, and I'm going to tell you this, it's a spoiler for my New Hometown theory, which you could watch again if you want. The reason I believe this is because we can see into Asgore's basement at one point beyond those double doors that you can see in Chapter 1 if you go down there. We can see that there's a conspiracy board there, just like the one Carol has in her room, which again leads me to believe those two are definitely working together. If a Dark Fountain was made in Asgore's flower shop, what if it took elements from that conspiracy board, all that evidence that Asgore's collected? And again, to spoil the video that talks about this, in the Mantle game, there is a section that seems like it could be a representation of Hometown. There's also the names that get highlighted by Gaster if you type them in during the Gonermaker sequence, which seem to be random residents from Hometown like QC, who it doesn't make any sense to be important to the story of Deltarune, unless of course she saw something on the day Des disappeared, and therefore she's a suspect on Asgore's conspiracy board and will be an important player in Chapter 5, which is New Hometown. Again, New Home in Undertale is a grayscale version of the original home, which is the ruins. So the idea there might be a new hometown where Asgore is the king in Asgore's flower shop, which is called Flower King, where he has his conspiracy board of evidence, I think it works pretty well. You know? I think it kind of makes sense. Plus, we already had the establishment of photos as copies of reality that would be grayscale. I can't imagine anything else at this point. I could be totally wrong, though. So, that is the end of this theory. All that's left now is one last summary and how I think this will all actually end, right? Because I've sort of set up the stakes, so how will it actually end in the story of Deltarune? So, Deltarune only has one ending. However, just as many have stated before, the idea that our choices don't matter will be subverted, just not in the way you might think. No matter who is chosen as the sacrifice, right, whether it be Susie or Des or Noelle, through whatever sequence of events we go through throughout the story of Deltarune, there will always be someone to defend them. There will always be someone saying, no, I won't let this person be the sacrifice for the sake of everyone else. In other words, there will always be prisoners willing to fight back for the sake of defending themselves from pain, essentially the pain of losing whoever the girl with hope crossed on her heart is. And thus, the angel's heaven will never be banished, the story of Deltarune will never be finished. Just like Gerson talks about, the ending got so grand and terrible that it's just never written, right? We need to find a way, therefore, to write a new ending to Deltarune. A good ending, if you will. And I believe this is what Gaster wants us to do. I don't think Gaster set up this world with a dour ending where Susie dies, or Noelle dies, or Des dies. With the point of just hurting us, right? Of just giving us a character we love and then viciously ripping them away. I think Gaster wants to force us to improvise, to try to find a loophole, right? He wants to see how we'll react to this horrible situation. The Roaring is going to create a sea of darkness, a blank canvas. And at that point, it will be our time to create something new. Again, as Gerson suggests, one thing can overwrite that dark, the white pen known as hope. And Gerson believes Susie is the one who can achieve this. It will be time for us then, after Gaster has told his whole story to us, for us to tell a story to him using the characters of Deltarune. Now, the reason I have the Undertale 10th anniversary as one of the images on this slide is because what was the theme of the Undertale 10th anniversary? It was expanding areas from Undertale that we never saw before. It was the idea of fan creation, right? Of extending something that was already made, which Gerson also talks about, right? Lord of the Hammer was just based on the prophecy. So yeah, maybe they changed some things when they adapted it, but I think that's for the best, right? It shows the personality of the person who is adapting. I think that is how Deltarune will end. Not that it won't have an ending, it's just the ending will be purposefully unsatisfying to us. Like, it'll be sad. Deltarune will have a sad ending, where one of the characters we care about will die. Either it'll be Noelle, or Susie, or Des. Noelle will reunite with her sister just in time for her sister to die. Susie will sacrifice herself to save all the people she's come to care about over the course of the story, just when she's sort of got a grip on who she wants to be in the future. Or Noelle will be sacrificed by our callous actions, and what Des has enabled. Again, the sisters will reunite, but one of them will die before they can actually, properly reunite with each other. And then it will be up to us to figure out the loophole. And I think there's actually some precedent for this being true, in the case of the way Toby has sort of manufactured this game. If you don't know, Toby basically has the code set up, or, Toby and the team, I should be clear, so that every chapter launches as its own executable. What that means is that every chapter is basically its own game, which is why some items don't carry over super well, like the tea, which turns rotten, right? This seems like a really weird choice to me. Like, I won't say I'm a game dev genius or anything, but I don't think any other game has ever done it like this. Every other game with chapter-based release strategies just adds the chapter as it releases onto the full game that already existed, right? It's not like, well, okay, there are cases of games that add a chapter as an entirely new game. The one that comes to mind for some reason is Garten of Banban. But there are games that do that, but generally they don't do it from like the same menu, like you open Deltarune and then you are given a menu of chapters to select from, and then that opens another game. Like, it's just so weird. Unless, of course, your plan was to make these chapters module in the first place, so that, you could replace vanilla Deltarune Chapter 2 with Deltarune Chapter 2 rewritten or something. And at the end of Deltarune's game, again, people have found in the files that there are up to 11 chapters you can make in Deltarune. There's 10 chapters plus Chapter 0, which is probably just dummy code. But if this is a big if, the plan is to allow us to create our own chapters of Deltarune at the end of this game, inspired by all of the AUs for Undertale that basically kept the game alive for so long. It would make a lot of sense to have some extra buffer room for new chapters. What if you want to write what happens after Susie dies, right? And everything goes back to normal in the world of Deltarune. What happens next? Well, then you need a Chapter 8 or a Chapter 9. What happens if you want to make a playable version of the story I just told you, like the prologue where Des and Kris fight each other in the Dark World? Well, you'd need a Chapter 0, right? I don't think this is insane. I think that's very doable. Like, especially if you are allowed to make sprites for your own characters, but the expectation is you will use the characters already provided for you in Deltarune. And just like a Mario Maker, for example, mix and match them throughout the game in order to tell your own story. I don't know. That seems doable to me. It's insane, but it seems like something Toby might do. And again, the other thing I need to preface here is that Deltarune is based off of this dream Toby had, right? Of a game. And so in order for Toby to wake up and go, I need to make this game, I need to dedicate my life to making this game, you'd think the idea at the end would be incredible, right? It wouldn't just be like, this is a cool twist. It would be like, this is something that's never been done before. And I think this makes sense for something that's never been done before. Basically letting the players make their own ending, still providing them an ending, again, if they don't want to go through all the hassle, but giving them all the tools and all the motivation to do it, And finally, that, my friends, is the end of my last Deltarune theory. My God, I've been recording for 2 hours.